Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue pour cette deuxième journée du vape.
Welcome everybody, welcome to the second day of the Vape Expo Fair 2015. I've got the pleasure of welcoming Professor Neil McInerney, who's the director of the Centre for Drug Misuse Research in Glasgow, Scotland. And we're going to speak this morning about the issue of standardization, of vaping, of the attempts of some states to regulate vaping, with also fears that can be expressed regarding the ramping up of the number of vapers. And we will speak about the attempts to forbid vaping in public venues, taking the example of Wales, where there's an attempt to pass a bill that would forbid vaping in all public venues. But before that, I'm going to give you the floor, Professor, so that you can introduce yourself and present the center that you manage that works on addictions. And first of all, I'd like to know what are your actions vis-à-vis vaping.
You're wondering, really?
Du centre.
Of the center.
Oh, okay. Center. So the center has been running since 1994, and we've been carrying out, my colleagues and I have been carrying out a wide range of research on both illegal and legal substances, mainly from a behavioral perspective, so trying to understand why people use certain drugs with what impact. We have become increasingly focused, as has many research groups, on electronic cigarettes, as their use has expanded massively. And I think that anybody working in the field of addiction now needs to focus on electronic cigarettes and vaping, because it's becoming a site of huge controversy as people grapple with in some ways quite strange inclinations to seek understanding, which is certainly perfectly appropriate, but also to rush to regulate, and to regulate in many countries with an increasingly heavy hand. And I think this whole area raises fundamental questions about how we function in circumstances of some considerable uncertainty, and the reaction to that uncertainty in relation to e-cigarettes, particularly with regard to the proposed long-term harm, the hypothesized long-term harm, or the hypothesized normalization of smoking, is generating, it seems to me, an extreme reaction on the part of some elements of the public health community, which is proving, in many countries, including my own, hugely influential in terms of determining public policy. And I think that in a way which many people would not have anticipated, gatherings such as this today could easily become illegal. So the idea that vapers could come to a setting to vape, to find out information about vaping, to purchase vaping equipment, to share their experiences, in a way which is completely incongruous, could become a criminal act. It could become so stigmatized, so prescribed, that it would simply not be allowed to happen. And when you think that what one's talking about here is not some deviant activity, but actually may well be the most significant element of reducing tobacco-related harm, it's just absolutely inconceivable that we should seek to apply such draconian legislation on this area of behaviour, although that is precisely what is happening, not in one country, but across the globe.
Alors, professeur, pour vous donner la contradiction.
So, Professor, to contradict you in a way, let's watch a video by the Minister of Health of Wales that expresses his will to regulate vaping.
Well, the bill is designed to protect and improve the health of the people of Wales. It's a public health bill. It looks to protect people against dangers to public health that we know of already, and it anticipates issues that may occur in the future. The aim, as always in public health, is to make sure that where harm is avoidable, we take action to avoid that harm. Well, it's certainly not dangerous. all the bill does is to bring the use of e-cigarettes into line with conventional cigarettes. Where you can use an ordinary cigarette in Wales, you can use an e-cigarette. Where you can't use a conventional cigarette, you won't be able to use an e-cigarette either. That will make enforcement of the law simple and straightforward. It will prevent the renormalising of smoking. It will help us to bear down on the way that e-cigarettes are becoming a gateway to conventional smoking for young people. Wales will join more than 40 countries worldwide that have already taken this step. I think people in Wales deserve the same protection as people in France or Spain or Malta or Australia or New Zealand or many states in America, and that's all that our bill does. Well, our bill preserves the ability of anybody who thinks that an e-cigarette is a way of getting off smoking. There's nothing in our bill at all that will stop that from happening. But there is very strong emerging evidence, both in Wales but worldwide, of the way in which the e-cigarette industry targets children and young people, uses them because nicotine is a highly addictive substance, between 5 and 10 times as addictive as cocaine, for example, to draw young people into the habit. We're absolutely determined in Wales that we will not allow the harm that has been caused to the health of generations of people through conventional smoking to go on happening through e-cigarette use. So we do that difficult thing of separating out use. Where it is helpful, there's nothing in our bill that will stop it being helpful in the future. Where it risks harm, we will act now to stop that harm from happening.
Mark Drakenford, le ministre.
Mark Drakenford, the Minister of Health of Wales. So, Professor, you know this point of view. We are at the crossroads of the implementation of public policies to fight against nicotism, with the fear that e-cigarettes would really normalise tobacco, whereas all public policies aimed at denormalising it. And there are public officials in Wales and elsewhere that explain that it is a door of access to tobacco and nicotism. How do you react?
There is the logic underpinning these moves is, I think, very clear. You have a situation where public health officials have created what I would have described as a narrative of fear, not based on evidence, but merely an anxiety which they have about something that may happen in the future, but where there is no indication of it actually happening in reality. And these individuals, I think, ordinarily ought not to occupy positions of huge influence on public policy, because it is leading them to take decisions which actually are not about harm reduction. They are likely to result in harm escalation. I think that when you have a senior official, such as we've just heard, talking about the renormalisation of smoking, I've yet to see the evidence that that is actually occurring. I think as we as a society become more familiar with vaping, it's less and less likely that somebody vaping would be misinterpreted as somebody smoking. I think most people in societies where vaping is now very visible can spot the difference immediately, and if it isn't immediate, it's quite quickly resolved as to whether someone's vaping or smoking. And yet to have that misapprehension driving policy in this area is completely ludicrous. I think to advocate laws on the basis that it makes other laws easier to implement is also completely ludicrous. I think if we were devising laws on the basis that it makes other laws easier to implement, we would find ourselves in a situation where every single facet of public life was being much more closely and over-regulated, no doubt for the best of intentions, but actually to huge detriment. And I think in relation to vaping, as I said in my introduction, if we were not talking about what may be the most significant tool in smoking-related harm reduction that we've actually seen since cigarettes actually started to be consumed, it would be laughable. But actually this is not an area of humour. This is an area of huge public health harm, and we have the opportunity to reduce that harm. And yet we have public officials who seem to be dedicating themselves to making electronic cigarettes less and less available, less and less accessible. And they're doing that under the guise of a narrative of protecting communities, when in actual fact the output of their action is to make people more and more vulnerable. And it's striking in a way that these are individuals who are utterly unaccountable. So in the aftermath of their proposed legislation to reduce access to electronic cigarettes, if we actually see a decrease in the uptake of electronic cigarettes and a similar impact on the rates of smoking, so that rates of smoking cease to decline in the way in which they have been doing, because electronic cigarettes are less and less accessible, then the cumulative output of their efforts would have been to make their population, the population for which they deem themselves to be responsible, actually sicker, not more healthy. And yet, of course, in that event, it would be a tragedy for the various people in the population, but the individuals themselves would be utterly unaccountable, and they would no doubt move on to the next moral panic and seek to regulate individuals' behaviour in some other domain under the guise of protecting people. I mean, it seems to me that if one wanted to create a situation where there was ever greater confusion around is someone vaping or is someone smoking, then the last thing you do is make vaping less and less visible, because its very visibility is what enables people to come to judgment that what they're actually seeing isn't smoking at all, it's actually vaping. So the kind of nonsensical position that the solution to the misapprehension of vaping as smoking is to make vaping less and less visible is just completely ridiculous. I think most people in society don't have any difficulty in distinguishing between these two things. Increasingly, the technology of vaping makes it immediately evident that someone's holding an electronic cigarette, they're not actually smoking a combustible cigarette. But the increasing regulation in many countries will actually, ironically, make vaping less and less distinguishable from smoking, A, by reducing its visibility, and B, by reducing the actual quantity of the refillable tanks that vapers can use. So what now looks like a piece of equipment that bears no similarity whatsoever to a cigarette could, as a result of the legislation which is now being developed across Europe, it could have the unwanted outcome that vaping starts to look more, not less, like actually smoking combustibles.
Alors, vous expliquez que ces barrières ont quand même un risque énorme pour...
You're explaining that these obstacles have got are more and more dangerous for fighting against nicotine. You're in face of vapors, of professionals. Concretely, what is your position today? Is it possible to explain to officials, public health officials and this minister that despite their so-called goodwill vis-à-vis vaping, they are maintaining people in nicotine, they are collaborating in a way to keeping people smoking cigarettes. And from this point of view, they prevent smokers to stop smoking. And so you're in face of this paradox where people who are supposed to be the most committed to fighting against nicotine are those who keep smokers smoking cigarettes.
I think there is a role for those who are fortunate to have some sort of public platform. There is a role to challenge public officials when they adopt positions which one can see are actually about harm promotion rather than harm reduction. But in a way, I think that the social movement of the vaping community itself is a hugely influential voice, and that you must seek as many ways as possible to make that voice heard. I think my colleagues and I have carried out research. We have a survey which recently concluded, which demonstrated the willingness of vapers to talk about their experience with smokers, to encourage smokers to switch to vaping. And I think that the more and more avenues of communication through social media are the right tools here. Because actually, I think many of the public health officials that are seeking to restrict vaping are not technologically savvy for the most part. They're from a generation for whom social media is some strange, unknown, domain. And yet, that is the domain of most immediate rapid communication. So I do think that through social media, the vaping community, which in itself is a tremendous resource. I mean, nobody could have previously spoken about a tobacco community because most people smoking tobacco didn't actually want to be smoking tobacco in the first place. They actually, when they're asked, they often themselves advocate ever greater restrictions on smoking. That's not the case with vaping, and I think that the vaping community rightly needs to mobilise itself to challenge these public officials, the right of these officials to impose their regulations on the community. And of course, there is a political dimension to this, and although these officials are often unelected, the ministers that they represent are elected. And I think that in each of the countries where very restrictive legislation is being developed or has been imposed, in the public arena, individuals need to be challenged as to the logic and the potential consequences of their action.
Avant de passer,
So before we give the floor to the audience, the report of Public Health England, it's the time when the scientific community managed to influence the political area. But do you think there's a misunderstanding of vaping in the UK, in Scotland? Maybe you will become independent one day. Is it a turning point for the UK and for Europe and the rest of the world?
I think that the Public Health England report, and a report which was very much sanctioned by our leading anti-smoking lobby, Action on Smoking and Health, was tremendously valuable in setting out a very clear message of the relative harm of combustibles and nicotine vaping products. And they were very brave to do that in a context where there are hugely personal attacks on people working in this area. And it was predictable in a way that the immediate reaction to the publication of the Public Health England report was just that, tremendously personal attacks on some of the scientists involved in doing this work by individuals who are driven by almost a religious fear about this idea about renormalising smoking, leading them to make personal attacks on the various scientists involved. I think that the hugely regrettable outcome of that, though, is the confusion which will no doubt be instilled in many people's minds that actually vaping may well be as harmful or almost as harmful as combustibles, and there may well be a decrease. So as more of those voices emphasising the harms of vaping as opposed to the potential positive benefits of vaping, the more those voices stressing the risks and the harms are given a public platform, then I think the predictable consequence of that will be that more and more people will entirely wrongly perceive vaping to be as harmful or almost as harmful as smoking combustibles, and there will be a slowdown in the rate of uptake of electronic cigarettes, and that will be directly attributable in many instances to the misinformation that has been put out around vaping.
est-ce qu'il y a des questions?
Are there any questions? Nelly, you had a question? Yes, please.
Informative. I was wondering, is there much information on new vapors? Can you give us any background and statistics of who is taking up vaping? We see in the media people like Nick Clegg has taken up vaping, and some others you see in the the trade press, some of the older smokers now going into vaping. But there's always seemingly this criticism of the industry that it focuses on the youth. Is there much information on who is really taking up vaping? Who is crossing from the combustibles and who are the new vapors?
Well, we are analysing the results of a survey of over 7,000 respondents in various different countries at the moment, and our finding from that is that the numbers of young people starting vaping is tiny relative to the proportion of established smokers who are taking up vaping. The proportion of people who are taking up vaping who haven't previously smoked is tiny. It's in single figures, the percentages. And I think that you're absolutely right. The public story that's being told around e-cigarettes is one where the substantial level of harm reduction is being eclipsed by the small evidence base of uptake amongst population groups who one would legitimately have anxieties about. So the numbers of young people who are vaping nicotine is not great relative to the older population of established smokers who are vaping. But that is largely the story, and it's a story of anxiety and fear. And I think, sadly, although I generally don't berate the media, because I think it's a completely pointless activity to do that, but you can see nevertheless how those stories of untypical or atypical uptake of vaping by young people who are not previously smoked is a media-rich story. But I think these things are often more complex than they first seem. So even in an indication where you have a young person who is taking up vaping, who hasn't previously smoked, one has to recognise that there is also a substantial risk that they might otherwise have started smoking. And we know that most smoking onset is in the early teen years. So whereas it's easy to generate a knee-jerk reaction, adverse reaction to the idea of a young person starting to vape who hasn't previously smoked, it's easy to create a moral panic around that, although that is not a common pathway. Even where that pathway occurs, I think one needs to be rather more judicious in terms of how that's responded to, given that this is the age at which there is the greatest likelihood of smoking combustibles starting. But I think this is a situation which we absolutely need to continue to monitor. I think that it isn't that anxiety about young people taking up vaping shouldn't become the touchstone to determine policy in this area. I think that where there are indications that non-smoking young people are with increasing frequency taking up vaping, then we should have appropriate health education, informing them of the nature of the product that they're consuming and the risks. But I don't think that the consequence of that, although it may well be the consequence of that, should be a much increasingly draconian legislation around the accessibility of e-cigarettes. And I think that the idea of an advertising ban, it to me is completely, has very little logic to it. I mean, if you have an effective means of tobacco-related harm reduction, why wouldn't you want to tell anyone about it? The idea that somehow or other the advertising of this product should be so suppressed, the product itself should become so hidden when it's a product which can potentially generate such huge health reduction in health-related harm, is utterly incongruous. I mean, if one had a cure for cancer, it's like saying, yeah, you've come up with a cure for cancer, but you better not tell anyone about it because the medication will have a toxic element to it. Well, we know cancer medication is toxic in many respects, but nobody would sensibly suggest that you ought not to tell anyone about it and allow its use to be as widespread as possible. And I think the same is true with electronic cigarettes. I think they should be advertised. I can't see one sensible reason why one would not want to let people know about these products. I think that advertising should be regulated in the way in which other advertising is, and if there are any indications that adverts were being developed that appeal to children, then those adverts should be tightly regulated. But I don't think that the consequence of that should be that we shouldn't be advertising this product. It's just how we advertise the product, which I think is where we should be focusing attention.
Est-ce qu'il a une question?
Another question? I've got one last question for you. I'd like to do some fiction politics. I'd like to know from your point of view in 10 years' time the consumption of vaping, what would be the proportion of vaping in relation to smoking in 2025? The number of vapers and the number of smokers in 25?
I mean, predicting the future is an activity that's doomed to failure. It's clear that the tobacco industry is mindful of the increase in the numbers of vapers, and in some ways is for reasons of finance, positioning itself to have a place within this market. Although it is still evident from the research that from the large numbers of people that initially try vaping, the proportion who continue to vape is actually quite small. So I think that the technology at the moment is appealing to large numbers of people, but that it's not necessarily engaging them long term. And I think that that is something which is going to change, certainly. The technology itself is changing rapidly, and I would think that the numbers who drop off from initial experimentation will inevitably reduce. But it's not entirely clear to me or my colleagues that vaping is in itself a product which will completely eclipse smoking combustible tobacco. I mean, many of those smokers, for example, who have marginal interest in quitting but who try vaping often comment that it isn't for them the same as smoking. Smoking is the thing that they see that they most want to continue with even after they've had an initial experimentation with vaping. I think those who are committed to, or in some ways at least committed to coming off smoking, are a more favourable community who are more open to the fact that the vaping experience is not the same as smoking combustibles, but that difference between the vaping experience and smoking combustibles will, I think, still mean that there will be a substantial section of the population who will prefer to continue to smoke combustibles. And it may well be that in the future that we see, just as we've seen with the development of electronic cigarettes, a multitude of technologies which are about different ways of making nicotine available, which in the long term may supplant combustible tobacco, but I don't think that electronic cigarettes, at least in their current form, are going to do that within the next 10 or 15 years.
Merci beaucoup, Professor McKenna-Gay.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKenna-Gay. I'd like to thank you to have participated in VAP Expo. Thank you for your support to the survey of VVAP and VAP Expo that we presented yesterday, the first results of. We will look all the results of this survey regarding 2,500 vapers in the coming months. You are going to now listen to Mr. Konstantinos Vassalinos to talk about the Eurobarometer of the European Commission. Thank you.
Thank you.